Hello chess fans and welcome to another video in our series Every Chess Move Explained. In this series we are looking at some of the most famous chess games of all time and breaking them down one move at a time so that everyone, but especially beginning and intermediate players, can better understand the narrative and struggle in top-level master games. Today we are looking at the famous game Lasker vs. Thomas from 1912. Now this is not Emanuel Lasker, the famous world champion who was world champion for a record 27 years, including the year this game was played. Instead, it is Edward Lasker, also an outstanding chess player and writer who won many US Open champions, and very likely a distant cousin of Lasker, the world champion. Edward Lasker played this game as he was immigrating from Germany to the United States. And as he was doing that, he traveled through London, and the first thing he did was he went to the London Chess Club. Then, as today, going to the local chess club when you're in a new city or a new country is an outstanding way to make friends through the international language of chess. So his opponent in this game is Sir George Thomas, also an outstanding player, an excellent British player, and a champion badminton player and strong tennis player. He helped found Wimbledon and played in some of the first Wimbledons. Fascinating person. So this game was a 5-minute game, but it's not a 5-minute game as we would understand it today. Instead, it was a unique format that was popular at the time where you could spend as much time as you wanted on any one move, but the total time you had spent could not exceed the total time your opponent had spent by more than 5 minutes. So if you're in the middle game and you've both used 30 minutes, then the amount of time you have to think on your next move is up to 5 minutes, since you cannot exceed your opponent's total thinking time by more than 5 minutes. Fascinating format. I'd be interested to see a game with that format today. In any case, let's get into the action here as Lasker takes on Thomas. The game opens with pawn to d4, obviously an excellent move, the second most popular first move in the game. I do find it's a little bit slower of a first move than e4, which is not a bad thing. It just means the game develops more patiently. And I think that's because White doesn't castle as quickly, and also because the queen defending the pawn slows down some of the tactics that can happen early in e4 openings. So Black plays now pawn to e6, which is a good move that does let out the bishop and does prepare to push some pawns to stake a claim in the middle of the board. But it's also a move I can't recommend for beginners because you have to be ready to play the French defense if White plays e4. There's nothing wrong with that. It just means that you have to be very flexible and know multiple opening systems, which is challenging when you're a beginning or intermediate player. White plays knight f3, excellent developing move for the knight, of course, and now Black plays pawn to f5. The Dutch defense is an interesting opening. I play it myself. It's definitely playable, but I can't recommend it for beginning players because you are really softening the light squares over here. As we will see in the game, that's something that you have to be very careful about, and you can be punished for softening these light squares if you are not careful. So White plays knight c3, which is not a bad move either, but I really would prefer generally to play the c4 pawn, play the pawn up to c4 before putting the knight in the pawn's way. However, White's trying for a very quick pawn to e4 break here. That is a popular way to play. One thing I like to do when White plays the knight in front of the pawn is play d5, switch to a stonewall Dutch instead, where the knight is not very well placed blocking this pawn. In any case, Black plays knight to f6, which is a very good move, of course, developing the knight and controlling e4. And White plays bishop g5, pinning the knight and still hoping to play pawn to e4. Black plays bishop to e7, breaking the pin, developing, getting ready to castle, and now White plays bishop takes f6. Now, this is not a terrible move, but I really don't like giving up the bishop pair. Masters really value the bishop pair and would not want to give it up so early in the game. It's a very committal decision. So in any case, White does choose to do this. Black recaptures. Of course, this is the correct way to recapture, as you want to keep a healthy pawn structure. And White plays pawn to e4, which is the entire point of playing the bishop to g5 and then exchanging on f6. Black, of course, can't tolerate that pawn and does capture it, and White recaptures. It's a good moment to pause and evaluate the exchanges that have taken place. So in this position, white has given up the bishop pair to break e4. That gives him a little bit of freedom in the middle of the board, but he also allowed the exchange of a key center pawn for a bishop pawn, which is not usually something you want to do. I think the upshot is that white has lost the opening advantage, and I can't really recommend this strategy of a quick exchange on f6 and then pushing for e4. Honestly, I think it's a little bit impatient. Black now plays pawn to b6, getting ready to bring this bishop out and fight for those light squares in the middle, again including e4. That's such an important battleground. And now knight to e5. Now, there's a good principle in chess that you don't want to move a piece twice in the opening when you've still got other pieces to develop. I think that's a really good principle in this case, although there are many exceptions to that rule. White has lots of other things to do. I don't recommend this move, and it gives black the option to capture the knight at any point and saddle white with a weak pawn, which could have been a problem, as we will see. This does have a threat of queen to h5, though, and black castles and stops that threat. And of course, castling's great, making the king safe, and safer at least, and the rook gets now to the half-open file, which is nice. So bishop to d3 now, developing the bishop to a promising square certainly makes sense. And now at this point, I think it was already a good idea to take on e5. Bishop takes e5, pawn takes. Let's go after that pawn with knight c6. And then if queen h5, which tries to defend the pawn and think about some attacks, including mate on this square, rook f5 is a great move. And now this pawn will fall and black gains a big advantage. So this is a problem after knight e5. However, Thomas doesn't try to exploit this, and he goes just bishop b7. Honestly, this is just a little lazy. It doesn't feel like he's taking white's build-up seriously, and his moves don't feel like they're addressing the needs of the position on the board at this moment. Now, queen h5, another threatening move, and at this point, it really is kind of put up or shut up territory. You need to respond very carefully here. White has 3 minor pieces here and the queen pointing at the king. It was the right time to take on e5 here, and then after pawn takes again, rook to f5 is a good idea. You're attacking the queen, you do still win this pawn, and you gain the advantage. However, after queen h5, black played queen to e7. Now, there is an idea here, but this is a losing move, okay? White now wins spectacularly with one of the most famous, most spectacular, most beautiful chess moves of all time. I want you to pause your video if you can and try to figure out what the move is and calculate as far down the combination as you can. So presumably you've spent 30 minutes and now you've seen everything already, so I'll just be demonstrating what you've already calculated. Now, first off, it's important to note in this position that the move knight takes f6, which many of you might have been drawn to, especially if you're a beginning player or an intermediate player, does not work. The problem isn't rook takes f6. If rook takes f6 or queen takes f6, then we can take on h7. The capture on f6 opens up the bishop and the queen to participate in a two-piece attack on this square. Now the king can't capture because the bishop defends the queen, so it's forced over and we mate on the back rank. Note that the knight is covering the f7 square in front of the king. Very, very nice checkmate, of course. However, after knight takes f6, the point of queen e7 was that the pawn can capture on f6, and now the queen on e7 defends this pawn. There is no checkmate. There's a very interesting game ahead, but it is not a game in which white will finish the game with checkmate by move 20, as we'll see in the actual game. So instead, after queen e7, the correct move here is queen takes h7 check, a magnificent queen sacrifice. The only legal move is to capture with the king, and now the intended follow-up here is knight takes f6. This way, we create double check from the bishop and the knight. When you're in double check, you cannot block the check because you can't block two checks at once, and you cannot capture the checking pieces because you won't get out of both checks at once. So you must move the king. It's the only way out of a double check. Now, if the king steps backward with king to h8, we have knight g6. I've always found two knight checkmates to be some of the most beautiful in chess, and this is no exception. One knight to cover the escape squares, one knight to deliver the checkmate. Notice also that the weakness from playing f5, the Dutch defense is now apparent as this g6 square is soft. So after knight takes f6 check, the king is forced up the board with king h6. I want to pause just briefly now and talk about calculation. When you're looking at a combination like that, like this, it must seem magical to see how far white saw down this path. But to calculate combinations like this, what you really have to do is focus on the forcing moves. That's usually checks and captures. Now, in this particular case, we've given up a whole queen for a knight, so we're really focused on checkmate. We can't settle for winning some material back. So we're going to be focused specifically on checks, and specifically on checks that are driving the king into a position where we can checkmate him. This is a king hunt, and in a king hunt, you see the king that has been driven out of the castle position, usually chased towards your pieces, because as he comes up the board, your pawns and your rooks and such pieces can participate in the attack and really lead to a likely chance of success. We're very optimistic when we see the king in a position like this and with no way to get back to g6 or h7 to escape our attack, but we still need to be precise. We want to be looking at those checks. Now, in this position, the strongest check is this knight to g4 check. If we had checked with the other knight, the king would have been able to go to the h5 square, so we leave this knight here, and now the king is forced up to g5, the only legal move that the king has. Now, interesting here is the two knights are stuck defending each other, so any checks from either knight would be bad because the king could capture the other knight. So we now need to involve new attacking pieces. As I said a moment ago, as the king approaches your side of the board, start to use those pawns. They're going to really help out. Now, white had two choices here. White could have played and did not play pawn to f4 check. This leads to a great checkmate that white didn't see because white had already calculated another checkmate. If the king chooses to exit the check from f4 by running this way, we have g3 check. The king steps up here. And this is a really nice checkmate. We check here, which forces black to block the check and allows knight to f2. If we had checked with the knight first, the king could have gone to this square. So by throwing in the bishop check, we force the bishop to step in the king's way. Beautiful checkmate here. If we back up, after f4 check, if the king captures here, pawn to g3 is a fantastic checkmate when either king back, h4 is checkmate, or king up runs into castles checkmate. Beautiful. Castling and checkmating is an amazing thing. This is important that you castle here because you can't play rook f1. Well, you can play it, but it's not as correct because then the king gets to g2. So by castling, both the king and the rook help to deliver checks and cover escape squares and create that final checkmate. So after king g5, f4 check would have checkmated and even checkmated a move faster than what happened in the game, but white picked h4 check instead, which is also excellent. After h4 check, the king is forced up to f4, and now pawn to g3 check. Again, more pawns participating in this king hunt forces the king to f3. Now, the fastest way to checkmate here is just to cover this square, pawn, cover this square g2 so that the king can't run here. So after king f1 or castling queenside, nothing black does can stop knight to h2 and checkmate. So we just got to cover g2 and then knight h2 is checkmate, which is really, really pretty. Retreating like this and giving checkmate is fantastic. However, in the game, what black played was bishop e2, which is also great, of course. And the king is forced up the board to g2. And now rook h2 check pushes the king to g1. The king has been driven all the way from his first rank to the opposite side of the board to white's first rank. This is a very special thing. And I only know of a few king hunts that have managed to drive the king from one side of the board to the other. They are very special finishes. Almost every game I've seen where this happens is a beautiful, beautiful game. So after the king reaches g1, pause your video and find the winning move if you haven't already. So I actually should have said winning moves because there are two. In the game, king d2 checkmate was played. sliding out of the way of this rook on a1, which is basically the only piece that hasn't participated in the attack. So it's very nice that it gets to deliver the final coup de grace. However, I and many other chess players have complained that the game should have ended by castling queenside and delivering checkmate. Of course, checkmate is checkmate, but how often do you get the chance to deliver a checkmate by castling and by castling queenside? The opportunity is literally a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So I think both checkmates are beautiful. The game is beautiful, but the game should have ended with castling queenside and checkmate. I hope that you've enjoyed this game. If so, please do like and subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of future videos. And also check out the playlist Every Chess Move Explained for more famous games broken down like this.